So anyway, thank you very much for joining us. And as I say, welcome to this Transport Planning Society panel discussion on tackling hate crime on public transport. I'm Mark Frost. I'm the current chair of the Transport Planning Society, and I'll be looking after proceedings this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us, taking the time out of your busy days to come and partake in this what we think is a very important debate, which is particularly important for the profession, but one that probably doesn't get enough attention by transport planners. For those that don't know us, the Transport Planning Society is the professional body for transport planners in the UK and Ireland. And we exist to facilitate and develop and promote best practice in transport planning and provide a focus for dialogue and engage and between all those engaged in it, whatever their background or other personal affiliation. So this is a really good example of how we're reaching out beyond maybe some of the typical topics for the transport planning industry to understand the impact that we have on people from across a very broad spectrum of society. And inviting specialists who engage with that to speak to us as transport planners. This particular event is part of our Transport Planning Day campaign for 2021. We've been running this now for the last 3 or 4 years, and where we try to celebrate transport planning and indeed help shape its future. Each year, the Transport Planning Day campaign has a theme, and the theme for this year was equality, diversity, and inclusion. We chose that as a theme because we believe, and this is why most people get into transport planning, that we unlock people's horizons and help create opportunity for people to live their lives to the full. But it's a sad fact that despite that, not everybody has equal access to transport, and so is not able to take up the opportunities that it presents. And that's the case, as much the case now, despite great advances that have been made in this field over the last few decades, but still clearly a lot more to be done. Now, many of the attendees will appreciate that ED&I is a very broad theme, and much of our early planning for this event was based on how do we narrow that down into sort of manageable bite-sized chunks that we could structure events around and that would have real meaning for the sector. And very early on in those discussions, the impact that hate crime has on people's use of public space was picked up. I mean, clearly that was informed by a range of high-profile events, not least the tragic murder of Sarah Everard in South London. And we all took away from that, there was a need for the transport planning industry to look again at its practices and understand what it was that we could do to contribute to solutions to some of these problems. And you know, some of the statistics are pretty scary. A couple of points that I've got here I picked up from reading discussions on this. Between 2016 and 2021, the number of incidents related to disabilities, the number of hate crime incidents related to people with disabilities in England have increased by 24%. Religious hate crimes on English railways, tubes and buses have increased almost fivefold since 2013, and homophobic incidents have doubled. And for all the great amount of attention that we put into managing and designing public space, you know, clearly if you've been on the end of one of these incidents, that's going to have a very significant impact on your ability to move around the network, or indeed your desire to do so by particular modes. And indeed, across different population groups, there's vast discrepancies with how comfortable people feel moving around the network by different modes, particularly on their own. And I think that's something that the profession has to see as something of a failure and has to rise its game to be able to tackle. Many of you have seen the information that we gave out for this event before going live as a partnership with the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Hate Crime, and Sarah Owen MP was due to be with us today to give a keynote on the work that the APPG have been doing, and in particular its relevance for transport planners. Unfortunately, as is the risk when you work with busy MPs, an urgent constituency matter has turned up, which has meant that Sarah's unfortunately not able to be with us this afternoon. However, obviously we are recording this event, and the APPG have confirmed that they're very interested in exploring this matter in more detail, and see this as sort of very much the start of the discussion on how we can work together more effectively to tackle this issue, transport planners and people that are raising these concerns with parliamentarians. So we're going to pivot this to more of a panel discussion between our expert speakers that we've gathered here today. really interested in questions from the crowd, so please do use the Q&A function, and my team at Joe Field Group, who's helping us compare the event today, will be picking some of those out to pose to panelists later on. But first of all, I'm going to introduce the panelists so you know who you've got in front of you. So if I can ask Joe, if you can introduce yourself first.
Hi everyone, I'm Jo Field. I am the President of Women in Transport. I know that we have some Women in Transport members on the call, but for those of you who don't know us, we are the professional network and not-for-profit that empowers women to maximise their potential. And we support our members through a variety of networking and professional development events, including a mentoring programme and a programme that supports women into leadership roles. We also do the Secretariat of the All-Party Group for Women in Transport, which we help to set up, and that's to make sure we sharpen political focus on the issue of women's underrepresentation in the transport workforce. We have in our membership just over 800, but our network is much wider. We have over 12,000 followers on social media, and we're UK-wide. We have hubs in London, Scotland, the North East and the North West. And our members range from frontline operations to chief officer. So we really do represent all modes and all parts of the transport industry. And we're open to everyone, I should say. It's not just women, it's everyone working together to achieve a diverse workforce.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. Great to have you here. Lisa.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lisa Garrett, and I'm the superintendent from the British Transport Police. I look after the central section of London, so largely Transport for London. So that encompasses London Underground, the policing of London Overground, the Elizabeth Line and Docklands Light Railway. So I have 6 police stations and 2 further police posts across my patch, where I have a core responsive policing posts as well as a neighbourhood policing team.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa. Time out of your busy day to join us for the next hour or so. If I can also take the opportunity to introduce, I'll come to you in a moment, Tim, because we'll pass straight into your presentation. But if I can introduce Laura Putt, who joins us as well. Laura is the Vice Chair of Transport Planning Society. Do you want to say a few words, Laura?
Hi, everybody. It's great you can all be here with us this afternoon. As Mike said, my name's Laura. I'm the Vice Chair of the Transport Planning Society, and in my day job, I work at Transport for London.
Excellent, thank you. So what we've asked Tim to do is, one, to introduce himself in a second, and then just to sort of take us through a couple of slides and a little bit of background to the current campaign looking to tackle hate crime on public transport in the capital as a bit of a starter to how we can engage with this debate. And then we'll pass it back out to our panelists for some discussion around that, and then obviously go to the wider attendees of this event for Q&A after that. So Tim, if you want to introduce yourself and kick off the event.
Mark, a big thank you for that introduction, and a big thanks for the invitation to do this this little overview of the campaign. So I'm Tim Herbert. I work for Transport for London. My day job is an operational policy manager, and I work within CPOS, which is our specialist compliance policing on-street operations and security directorate. And amongst other things, we help manage the relationship that we have with the police, both the British Transport Police and the Metropolitan Police as well here in the capital. And I've been lucky enough, and I'm proud to be able to say that I've been involved in working on our hate crime efforts for around about 5 or 6 years now. It's something that we've been working on as an organisation in collaboration with our policing partners since around about 2016. And the campaign, which I'm about to take you through for a few minutes, is kind of the latest and almost certainly the most visible kind of output from that. I will declare a slight thing for you all to note before I go into this. My specialism isn't in campaign and marketing. I'm a hate crime lead for Transport for London. And I just want to give credit to my colleagues, particularly in the campaign, the customer marketing and behaviour change teams, and also our stakeholder engagement teams who have done so much work in helping to produce a campaign which really reflects the combined efforts of both those professionals and community groups and stakeholders that really have helped shape and influence the campaign into something which is far better and more relevant than we could have done without them. So real gratitude to them. So I'm going to attempt the first technical challenge, which is sharing my screen. So let's see how we get on. Fantastic, Mark. Thank you. The thumbs up is really welcome. So yeah, so what I want to do is just briefly talk a little bit more about the stakeholder engagement in this campaign. Hopefully, those of you that are in London will have seen this campaign. As I said, I'm not an expert on campaigns or marketing, but it's quite clear to me of the the power and the impact of this campaign. And I've been lucky enough to see the campaign out in the wild as well, and we'll perhaps see if we can bring up a slide to show that as well. And it really is very distinctive. And the approach which was used to help create the image and the impact that we were seeking is worth exploring as well, I think. So the stakeholder engagement I mentioned. So if anybody on this call is familiar with the world of tackling hate crime, the work that the police and other enforcement agencies have done, they'll be aware of the importance, the particular importance of engaging with community groups on hate crime. It really is something which is, which we can't ignore. And I think for all of us on this call, everybody who's involved in planning transport services and planning transport, particularly around this issue of hate crime and the impact that it has, we really do rely on our communities so much. So, for example, national organisations which are really well known in this space, organisations like Tell Mama, which is a victim support group for Muslim people who experience hate crime, CST, the Community Security Trust, which supports Jewish victims of hate crime, CARG, which is a fairly recent organisation which unfortunately has been necessary to start since COVID. It's the COVID-19 anti-racism group, where people in the UK, British East and Southeast Asian people experienced an increase in hate crime during the COVID-19 pandemic. And also we've worked with Gallup, which has done so much work on LGBT plus hate crime as well. So what I wanted to share as well is something which you might not be aware of is not only has hate crime got this huge personal impact on victims, and victims often talk about this deeply personal experience that they have when they are a victim of hate crime, very hurtful. It feels like something about themselves maybe is being targeted. But unfortunately, and this is why we think it's so important to have something which is so visible, unfortunately, hate crime has a wider impact on communities and not just on the individual. So we do know through talking to community groups and stakeholders that when there is a hate crime which takes place and it's reported or it's shared on social media, it has a really quite pernicious effect on community confidence, on that group's confidence to travel. I'm really pleased that Mark recognised the impact that it has in terms of accessing transport services. And we know that if people are fearful, they're much more likely to make other choices, perhaps in terms of travel, or they won't travel at all. So it really does have that that exclusion impact. So just talk a little bit about the campaign. I'll just see if I can make this move on one. So here's an example which I took at Euston when I was in London last week. Basically, this is part of a campaign which includes serious worrying incidents, and we include in that assaults against staff, abuse against staff, hate crime and drunkenness. So these are things, unfortunately, which our colleagues that are running the services every day, they are experiencing regularly. And so the hate crime element is one part of that. One of the things that we're trying to do as part of the campaign is really through the imagery create a sense of unity amongst Londoners and amongst people travelling. So actually say that, I stand against hate crime, and therefore by follows logically that if you're not standing together against hate crime, you're not part of that unity, then you're kind of an outlier, and you're possibly the perpetrator involved. So it's really trying to say to Londoners and passengers that we're in this together, and try to create that sense that we really are. We're not going to accept hate crime. It's zero tolerance on our services, and actually, you will stand out for the wrong reasons if you're not part of that supportive atmosphere. So a key element of the campaign is that behaviours won't be tolerated. One of the other things which we heard so clearly from our stakeholders is that there remains, despite this huge effort that us and the police have been making for some time, there remains quite a lot of confusion about how you report hate crime. Okay, so clear call to action in terms of, if you experience hate crime or you witness it or you're told about it, please tell us and tell the police. Yeah, it's so important that we don't just accept it as part of the transport experience somehow. And the other thing which I wanted to mention about the campaign as well is that everybody is the target of this campaign, actually. So passengers, customers, staff, victims, and also perpetrators. So we also want perpetrators to be aware that this is something that we're not tolerating. And then a little bit, and Mark, I'm just checking time. I have a habit of going over a bit on these things. So a little bit of information about the kind of scope of this. So the campaign started back in June. We're expecting it to run through to March, when there'll be a kind of full review about the success of the campaign. And I can tell you a little bit about some of the measures that we're looking at. It's also the case that we did an additional uplift of the campaign during National Hate Crime Awareness Week. And this is really the biggest and kind of most significant event nationally, which is looking at hate crime and really trying to promote the fact that it's happening, unfortunately, and that collectively, as organisations like public transport, local authorities, the police and others should actually be doing something about it. So during October, during that week, we saw an uplift in the posters which were out and about on the network, and also there was a lot more targeting of other channels, such as some of the social media channels which TfL uses, like Instagram, Facebook, and some of the blogs. We also updated our webpage, which includes information about hate crime. And again, that has been developed to reflect the feedback that we had during those critical stakeholder engagement sessions. And there's also more information on there about how to report and what we're doing as well. One of the other things we did, which I'd encourage you to have a look at if you haven't seen it already, is we've got a video which includes a frontline member of our staff. It's somebody who works in the directorate that I'm in, talking about what hate crime is. We know still, because we still have this even within our own teams, that not everybody knows what hate crime is. They usually have quite a good idea, but the video includes what hate crime is, the fact that we are working as an organisation to try to tackle it and really say that it's not acceptable. And also there's a really helpful inclusion of one of our colleagues in the British Transport Police, a British Transport Police officer, talking about the channels for reporting hate crime as well. And then one of the other things we did during that week is we invited some of our stakeholders back into the organisation to talk about their experiences of hate crime and how we can do more. So Mark, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to leave on the final slide, which shows some of the additional imagery which we've got as part of the campaign. And I think then I'll leave it there, if that's okay, for the introduction.
That's excellent, Tim. Thank you very much. If I can pass then to our other panelists, just to offer some reflections on this, and then sort of wider comment on the topic of debate today. Maybe Joe, if I can pass to you first, and then we'll move to Lisa.
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for that, Tim. That was really helpful. I think the first thing to say is that women in transport members are coming at this debate from two angles. We are, within our membership, we have transport planners and engineers who can help to provide innovations and technical solutions to help make the network safer for everyone and give people confidence to travel. But also, we're all customers. We all use the transport network. So we bring a wide perspective and personal experiences that I'm sure we can relate to the issue of hate crime and bring to the debate. So we've got those two areas of expertise to add. I'm I should say, actually, first of all, I did used to work for Transport for London. I'm still a massive advocate for everything that TfL does. In particular, I like the stakeholder engagement element of the Hands Up campaign. My day job is a public affairs and stakeholder engagement consultant. And, so those of you who know me will know that making sure community voices inform policymaking is an issue that's very close to my heart. In terms of women in transport members, our members also stressed that it would be good for the actual experiences of people who have experienced hate crime to inform the solutions. So it's really good to see that TfL is playing a leading role in that. What else I like about the TfL campaign is that it sets out very clearly what hate crime is, how to report it, the support that TfL is offering to victims, and also what the process is for reporting, as well as adding in staff experiences to bring the issue to life. There's a few other things that are of interest to our members, actually, in terms of the campaign, or the document outlines that, what hate crime is not, and sexual harassment is currently not classed as a hate crime. And it also very helpfully outlines that misogyny has now been classed as a hate crime just from this autumn. I think this is on an experimental basis. And I know that women in transport members would overwhelmingly support misogyny continuing to be classed as a hate crime. So I think there's a Law Commission review going on at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. Equally, and I know we'll probably come on to this in a minute, about some of the solutions that transport planners can provide to help everyone feel safe to travel. And it's important when we think about the fact that the transport profession has a male-dominated workforce. I know we do have quite a lot of diversity amongst transport planners, but transport itself, only 20% of the transport workforce are women. So it's very important that the solutions that we come up with, the things that transport planners can do to help tackle the issue of hate crime, these solutions cannot be driven just by a workforce of white middle-aged men. So we need to make sure that we use the diversity that we have in the profession, but also the diversity of community voices that can help us to provide solutions. And equally, the issue of hate crime, we need to get to the root causes of the problem. And while transport planners can provide some solutions, there's a big emphasis that needs to happen in terms of educating young people, children in schools from a young age, and tackling deep-rooted societal problems, which I don't think, transport planners can definitely save the world, but, arguably this is not their role. It requires cross-government coordination.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I think that's a really key area for the sector, actually, is to what extent we can offer genuine support and solutions within the toolkit that we have available for us at the moment, and how much of it is this sort of wider societal issue that we with all the best will in the world we will struggle to address as transport planners. Lisa, can I pass over to you then to offer some reflections and some wider comment on this as something that you don't have to deal with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to pick up on some of Tim's and some of Joe's points, actually. So I think the really big thing for me is hate crime is very, very distressing because it's based upon who you are. So it's, as Tim actually pointed out, it's not only the victim who suffers, but the victim's family and the community. It's really impacting and really huge. And we do recognise that as a police service. But I think it goes wider than a lot of other crimes. I think there is still some confusion around hate crime as well, about what actually is a hate crime. So I'm going to clarify that now for everybody. It's a criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or anybody else to be motivated by hostility or prejudice towards someone's either race, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, or disability. So those are those protected characteristics. And I know this sometimes gets confused with the 9 protected characteristics, which is often used with the Sexual Equality Act in various employment laws and things. So I think it's really important to make that distinction very first off. So a hate crime can include verbal abuse, intimidation, threats, harassment, assault, and damage to property. Generally, from our point of view, from a policing point of view, it's based upon verbal abuse or physical abuse, threats, harassment. We don't see very much of it as damage to property. And of course, we also record hate crime incidents, which is Tim picked up on, is about the behaviour, which again is perceived by the victim or somebody else motivated by that same hostility based on those same characteristics. And we have a zero tolerance approach to the behaviour and obviously to the criminal offence as well. As you say, you know, it's one of our objectives, it's one of our key objectives within our policing plan, and it will continue to be focused upon by the British Transport Police, the Metropolitan Police and all the Home Office forces that we work closely with. It's very, very key for us. But there are some significant challenges around reducing hate crime, preventing hate crime. And Joe certainly picked up on this about the awareness. So educational establishments, the young people of today are the people we really need to be kind of getting into. Very much how we're focusing our approach after and even before, so actually, the tragic murder of Sarah Everard, how we really need to look at behaviours of society with regarding sexual harassment. We need to be doing this exactly the same for hate crime. So that awareness and the campaign that TfL are doing and the national hate crime campaign really does bring things like this to the foresight for everybody, but it can't really just end there. It needs to be other agencies and parties involved. It needs to be schools stepping up to the mark. And, you know, I think they've come a long way. I think educational establishments are certainly doing that now, and colleges and universities becoming more talked about, more challenged. And then once we've got to a more comfortable point with awareness, I think the real biggest challenge for us is the confidence in reporting. So there are a number of ways of reporting to the police, obviously to TfL. And I do think, and research shows this as well, that actually the people who are victims or witnesses as well, because you often will get bystanders, and they're not confident necessarily to report to the police for a whole host of reasons. And if we go some way to understanding those reasons and those barriers to reporting, we need to explore all those barriers. And by understanding those barriers, we can then make it more accessible for those victims and those witnesses to come forwards. And it can be very simple, like they're not aware the 6106 number that BTP put out all the time. We've done a bit of research on that, and a lot of people have stated, oh, actually, we thought that was for bags. We think that's a counter-terrorism reporting mechanism. It isn't simply for that. It's for any crime, any sexual harassment, and any any kind of intelligence reporting at all, 61016, report it to the police. But we need to really get that message across to people travelling on the network. So that's a really key thing about just understanding. But also, I think what's become really key, because we've done quite a bit of work with Travel Watch and some of our own research, and working with the rail delivery group as well. Why don't people report? Unsure how to do it. But there's also, particularly with hate crime, also with sexual harassment, there is that real normalisation that this is what happens to me because I'm X, Y, or Z. This is what happens, and it's that acceptance. And this is what we've really, really got to work on with our community, to say, actually, no, that's really, really not acceptable. But that's bringing in a lot of partners, and as Joe pointed out, that's working with charities as well, and we've started to do a lot of work with charities, and Tim's mentioned that with Tell Mama and Gallup. Police are starting to work closer, because we have to make sure that we can understand our victims and why our victims are struggling to tell us. And there are a whole host of reasons as well. The whole criminal justice system, it's very uncomfortable to go through that, and to have a real understanding, to make sure that the officer who deals with the victim at the beginning is empathetic, because if they don't get the right response in the beginning, they will never come back again, and you can understand that. So there's a few challenges we've got, but we are working closely with our partners, working with TfL, working with the MPS, to try and identify what those barriers are for reporting, because once we can improve that reporting, we'll be able to work out where this crime is happening, because we do feel it is underreported. The other thing I did want to touch on is actually hate crime can often be triggered by something else. And this is something we're, again, working with TfL on. It's not necessarily a person comes onto the underground to actually commit hate crime. But what tends to happen, there's an argument over a ticket, or maybe a barrier closed, or you can't get a buggy through. This then escalates, or alcohol potentially. This then escalates into a public order situation, and also then hate crime. So finding what those triggers are quite complicated, and it's obviously quite difficult for the police, because you can't you can't work out where you're going to get people who are going to fare evade necessarily, or have some kind of issue with their ticket. It's quite a hard intelligence picture, I would suggest, hate crime, which is why we need to really focus on the reporting of hate crime and then polishing our investigations. What I will say is our solve rate's actually gone up since we've looked at our pre-pandemic year. So in 2019-20, it was less than 10% actually, and we've improved that to 13.6%. Still not enough, but we have improved our solve rate, because we're looking very closely at what we're doing, how we're doing our investigations. And of course, the beauty for the British Transport Police is, we have a lot of cameras. We are blessed with CCTV. We are blessed with the operators who download the stills for us. We have some very clever systems which we can identify offenders through, and we are taking full advantage of that. And so being a victim on the transport network, as harrowing as it is, there is more likelihood that we're able to catch the offender.
Lovely, thank you, Lisa. That was a real insight into your world there, and how seriously you take this issue. It sounds like this is a big part actually of what BTP do, and the effort that you put into it. I've got various questions that come off that, but I just wanted to offer Tim the opportunity to reflect on Joe and Lisa's contributions, and anything further he wanted to add on the topic.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Lisa and Joe as well. It's really useful to hear those comments and reflections. I think a couple of things I'll just mention, just to maybe start thinking about the kind of challenges that we have in making improvements in areas like reporting, like giving communities confidence report. I'm grateful that Lisa mentioned some of the design features of the transport system, such as the CCTV, which really gives us that advantage. And I think what I was going to say is that one other resource which is so critical to this this challenge is our own teams, our frontline teams that actually run our services. And I was really taken by the point that Lisa said about sometimes you really do just have that one opportunity to give somebody confidence that they're going to be taken seriously and that we won't dismiss their experience as somehow being not that important, or just, you know, words or something like that. And we do know, and Lisa indicated this, we do know that hate crime is seriously underreported. It makes it much harder for us to plan our response. So, for example, we can work within CPOS, within the directorate that I work in. We have enforcement officers, TFL enforcement officers, and we can direct them to locations where we know incidents are taking place, and we can use their high visibility and some of their powers to help prevent incidents or certainly support people who are victims. One of the features, unfortunately, that comes up very commonly with hate crime when we see it reported to us is this statement, and it always makes me feel so upset when I see it, but unfortunately it really is common. It's this statement from victims: nobody did anything. It is something which when we've done training with our teams, with our frontline teams, which we do on hate crime, we emphasize the absolutely critical importance they must act. And even though it may not be, it's not about placing yourself in danger or placing anybody else in danger, but you must act. And as a minimum, you can support the victim by explaining, you're so sorry what happened, it was completely unacceptable, and then help them to report that incident to the police. So that one opportunity, I was really taken by that from Lisa, that one opportunity to respond is so critical. And we can do it through talking to our teams and having conversations about hate crime with them and how they're expected to act in a way that can keep themselves safe, but also actually has an impact on this crime.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, the sort of reflections that I was picking up on was that there's sort of three parts to this puzzle. One is the actual design and structure of the network, with which transport planners have a big role to play in that. I was going to come and ask you for a second if there's any really good tools that you've come across that designers and transport planners can use to help us make sure the network does work and help and contribute to the eradication of this issue. And then there's the actual management of those spaces, the professional management of those spaces by your teams, Tim, as you say, the people on the front line delivering these services and in these spaces on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis, and Lisa's team supporting that. And then there's the community who can help by passive surveillance and community policing, simply by not tolerating this sort of stuff, but then perhaps more importantly, also helping contribute to the data picture by reporting it as best as possible. Does that feel like the sort of the sort of three main pillars that you do as a hate crime specialist, Tim? Perhaps I'm looking at you.
No, absolutely. It's a perfect way of summing it up, I think, Mark. Yeah, that's a really good structure for us to think around it. Yeah. And
just coming back to that point about the design, I mean, actually, I'd never thought about this, Lisa, but my personal experience is that hate crime or crime of any sorts can often sort of start from the most minor of incidents, and I wonder how much, and as you start getting into the data of this, how much of that it does come out of a design issue. As you say, if you can eradicate and design out the issues that cause minor annoyances, I wonder if by so doing you actually take out the spark which then provides a lot of flame for the rest of this issue. Is that your thought?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's actually vital, because if somebody's going about their journey from A to B without any kind of problems, they're generally in a better mood. When the trains are late, when they can't get through the barrier because of one reason, because there's a bottleneck, people start to get agitated. And I think what we are seeing, the reality is, since the pandemic, that people's tolerance levels are very different as well. So that's a challenge for us going forwards, that people need to learn behaviours again. And, you know, particularly as more people are starting to come onto the network, you know, we've all been used to having less people, more room, get onto the train. Now we're all shoved up against each other again. And people start to get stressed about that. And then the arguments begin, and then the public order situation begins, and it escalates very, very quickly. So I think that's actually really key. I think the other thing that I didn't mention as well is it's probably more difficult for us to engage with our seldom heard communities. We do our campaigns very much in English. A lot of our campaigns are digital, so there's that expectation that people will see things on their phones, etc., etc. So we're looking really carefully at that to make ourselves more accessible to those who don't necessarily speak English, because I think that's really important as well. And we're also really looking at the makeup of the police, and I know Joe touched on the fact about 80% of those working on the transport system are male. And I think what's more reassuring, and this has come to light very much since Sarah Everard's tragic murder, is that the diversity within the police service itself does make a difference to the confidence of those reporting to the police. So if you come from a LGBTQ plus community or a seldom heard community, you are going to feel more comfortable reporting that crime to somebody who kind of understands where you're coming from. So that's not going to be an overnight fix for us, because we're fairly male dominated, but we are really looking very carefully at that as well, so that we have a real wide representation across the police service, because we need to represent the community that we're policing to give them that confidence.
Yeah, and I think absolutely, and certainly that's a journey that we're on within our own sector about how do we get that representation, because without it, you're designing blind to a certain degree. I noticed that Nicola actually made the same point that I'd done about triggers and how do we, the role that they have in sparking this stuff off, and how we design them out. And Tom Van Vuren's posted the question about actually designing that stuff out is better for everybody. It's not just this issue around designing out hate crime per se, but does making that point, is that a distraction from the hate crime argument, or is it something that can help make and sell a focus on this issue? Any reflections on that?
I don't want to dominate here, but I don't think it is a distraction. I do think it's a benefit. I think it would be a benefit, massive benefit to public order across the transport network, which feeds largely into hate crime as well as, offences of violence.
I mean, you said this was a sort of work in progress, Lisa, about understanding some of those triggers. I mean, from a transport planning profession, that would be really valuable data that we could use, I think. Do you get a feeling for, is it largely at barriers? Is it at busy stations? Is it at unstaffed stations where people feel they can get away with this sort of stuff? Is there any sort of trend, or is it all sort of, across the board?
Yeah, there's a mixture, and we've only really started to really focus on the triggers for this recently. The work that Travel Watch have done, for example, was focusing very much on women and those from underrepresented communities, and it's their research which is feeding ours and complementing that of the RDG, which actually says, well, it actually started with couldn't get the buggy through, or it actually started with a row because of, bought a child's ticket or something like that. So we do have quite a lot of offences on barrier lines.
Yeah.
And then kind of the other time is the busy times. The busy times when people are very agitated and they want to get home.
So you don't necessarily see this correlation that actually it's those very quiet stations where this sort of stuff can crop up because of the lack of passive and community surveillance?
The incidents tend to happen at busier places. We do get different types of incidents at stations where you don't necessarily have so much ticket checking, so people can just get on and they've been used to getting on and they thought, right, for the last year I've got on the tube whenever I've wanted, and then suddenly now there's a member of staff there checking tickets. That behaviour then changes. But I think we're going to see a bit more. We're going to understand the pattern more once we see travel coming back more and travel coming back into London a lot more. I think then we'll be able to identify the patterns and work out which are the main triggers. Is it actually at this really busy station? Is it Oxford Circus, where you've got loads of different, loads of gates, loads of entrances, loads of exits? You know, we generally have quite a lot of issues there. Is it there, or is it right, you know, the top of the Northern Line where there's very few people and people can, you know, walk onto the station without really being challenged so much? And there is a little bit of both, but I guess what's really important as well is when we're focusing on making people feel safe, that we really need to focus on stations where people feel vulnerable, but are not necessarily at a high risk of crime. They're at a much lower risk of crime, but they feel really, really vulnerable.
Yeah. Joe, that touched on something you said, I think. Is there anything you want to offer a response to or further reflection on what Lisa's just said?
I think it's an interesting point. I think the key thing for me actually is getting this data, as Lisa has said, and also then looking at what can transport planners do to innovate and provide solutions. And so the points about gate lines were quite interesting, because some of the comments that our members have made on this issue is it would be better to have better lighting, better signage, and more staff at stations in the evenings and things like that. So it's interesting that that's perhaps not what the data is showing. The other thing I think is that we need to raise awareness across government, and this is going back to my point earlier about it being a societal issue, and we need all stakeholders, all industries, organisations like TfL, like Transport Planning Society, like BTP, and Women in Transport to work together. We need to raise awareness across government, which is why actually today's event is hugely important. And I'm glad that despite Sarah not being here, we're going to be able to share the results with her. I think we can also share the results with the APG for Women in Transport, and just make sure that we are getting cross-government focus on these issues.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely key, and obviously one of the key aims and objectives of the work that we do as a society on the parliamentary side. Tim, I had a couple of comments here in the Q&A around training for TfL staff, and whether that as a routine includes improving understanding of hate crime. And I wonder if I can add a rider to that, just to whether you've got are there any different findings from across different modes? Like, is there very different patterns on, say, the bus network than there is on the tube network, or the overground on the DLR, for example? Is there anything that we can take from that?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, no, thank you also about the issue about buses as well, which I was thinking was worth sharing. So in terms of training, we do different things with our teams depending on their role. It isn't currently the case that hate crime training is a kind of foundation training for every member of the frontline team in TfL. It is offered as part of an e-learning package which we've developed, and it has quite good take up, and we're looking at the way we can combine some of the learning from the hate crime training that we do give to our enforcement teams, for example, within other training which has some similarities. So, for example, and this has been mentioned a couple of times, such important work for us is our work on unwanted sexual behaviour on our services, and as part of that, we are rolling out a awareness raising module so that our teams can understand better about what type of thing they need to be aware of and how they can support victims. And a lot of the messaging actually is quite similar for hate crime. One of the problems, and I think Lisa alluded to this earlier, one of the problems we consistently have with hate crime actually is that there isn't good awareness of the current 5 categories which are included within hate crime, and there does tend to be quite a lot of confusion. And also there does tend to be a bit of confusion about what type of incident could class as a hate crime. So we really emphasize that. It's also worth saying as well, one of the most common misunderstandings is that you don't, if somebody's abusing me for, I don't know, my faith, for example, it doesn't matter what faith I belong to, is the intention of the offender. And this is something which isn't always understood as well. So we spend quite a lot of time talking to our enforcement teams about that, because we know they're so well placed to support bus drivers, for example. So to move into the buses area, they're probably less well placed to be able to support passengers when things are happening on the bus, but they do have the ability to call the control room, and it's co-located with the Metropolitan Police within TfL, for example. So there's really good response there from our colleagues within the Metropolitan Police for buses. And actually, what you see on London Underground, where often there's a trigger caused by a bit of tension or perhaps some frustration and things like that, it's actually quite common on buses for it to be caused by delays to services, and also the trigger of the ticket, unfortunately. So when we're challenging somebody about not having the right payment, that can often lead to these vile kind of racial slurs and other behaviours that are just so unpleasant. Yeah.
Interesting. Right, I'm conscious of time, and I want to give Laura a couple of moments just to sort of sum up from the TPS perspective. But there is one question here I thought I want to pose to all three of you, because I'd be interested in the response. I've got a view on this, but it would be great to hear what you say. So this is from Nicola, and it says, do you think there is a potential for some interventions aimed to protect more vulnerable or specific social groups, to actually isolate or further target those groups? So, and she's given the example here to illustrate the point about female-only carriages. So I know this is something that comes up in the news fairly regularly. I mean, my initial gut reaction is you're treating the symptom rather than the cause of the issue there, and I would sort of shy away from it. But then, I'd be really interested in your perspectives as professionals in this space. Lisa, you had your hand up anyway, but I'll go to you maybe to offer first response.
I'd like to come in here because I've done a lot of work on sexual offences and sexual harassment, and this was one of the things we did actually consider. But we worked with some academic researchers on this, and the problem you have for that particular thing that Nicola's raised, if you have a female-only carriage, for a start, you've already picked up on it and said, you're making the victim do something different to try and avoid that behaviour. But also, if you've got a female-only carriage, that carriage is then potentially another target. And we're looking at, certainly within sexual harassment, we're looking at men standing up as well for women and being part of that really strong voice to say, actually, that's really not acceptable. And we want to be in the same place with hate crime. So you've got, a white male and a black male standing next to each other. You want the white male to stand up for the black male as well. That's the space we want to be in. We don't want to have to segregate and make the victim do something. We need to concentrate very much on the offender and stopping the offender's behaviour, which is unacceptable. So it's a difficult one, and I do understand, and we have considered those options, but we are very much, if whatever religion you are, whatever sexual orientation you are, disability, transgender, whatever race you are, you should be able to get on any train, any bus, any carriage, and go from A to B and feel safe and secure. And that's where we want to be.
Yeah, that was my feeling. Joe, Tim, do you want to offer anything further before we draw the event to a close?
Yeah, I would like to, please. Yes, completely support what Lisa says. It's interesting actually, because women-only carriages was something that was raised by some of our members, but absolutely it's not something we would agree with, because it does fall into the camp of Lisa, as Lisa says, of saying that women should have to change their behaviour, or victims should have to change their behaviour, and sends a signal that the network is not safe, and we want everyone to feel safe on the network. So yeah, it's not a good thing. It's a backwards step in my view. It's about fully support what Lisa says about targeting perpetrators, and that needs to be done, yes, through campaigns and public information, but also through the early engagement and education with children and young people that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's great. And Tim, final word to yourself before I pass to Laura?
No, just to support everything that Joe and Lisa said there. It's absolutely right that we are focusing on offender behaviour. And I think one of the things I will add, Mark, and maybe it's just a final thought for all of us in terms of our professions, is, how do we create transport services and networks where there is that confidence amongst passengers to support other passengers and help them if they are experiencing hatred or hostility for any grounds. And I think that's something which, there's nearly always another passenger near you on a train or on a bus, and if they can be an ally for you, then that actually would, I think, have one of the biggest impacts that we could make.
No, that's a really key message, I think. Thank you all to all of our speakers. That was brilliant, a really interesting and insightful discussion. Certainly I found it so. Laura, do you want to offer just a couple of points that you've taken down?
Yeah, thank you very much to all of our speakers. I feel like this is definitely the start of a longer conversation, as there's been lots of challenging things brought up there that obviously we could want to identify some real actions that we can take forward. As I think the real challenge is, how can the transport sector as a whole be a better ally? So from the individual level that Tim talked about individuals helping if they see someone else experience a hate crime, up to an organisational level or training for staff that you've talked about. I'd also seen in Transport Scotland's hate crime charter, they are asking transport operators to pledge support for their hate crime. I wondered if we're doing that with TfL bus services, or if other local authorities or even wider organisations, whether a kind of pledge to support a charter could be an action we could take. And then right up to the government level, and making sure we can carry on working with the all-party parliamentary group on hate crime and for women in transport, and thinking about funding and legislation in this area to try and make some real improvements. And one kind of extra question I wanted to pose, there's probably not time, is just thinking about public transport. In my career, I've worked a lot on walking and cycling and thinking about public spaces. So I just wanted to highlight the point that ideally, I'd want people to feel safe just going out about and accessing wherever it is they want to go, whether that's a short walk or a cycle ride. So I wasn't sure with the 61016 number that Lisa highlighted, whether that can be used when you're just out in the street or in a public space, or is that specifically for bus or rail or underground services? But there's a whole host of things that I'll take away from today. And I think our colleagues at JFG will be writing up a short report with ideas for further action. So I'll be very happy to work with them on that. Thank you, everyone.
Lovely, thank you, Laura. Okay, I'll draw the event to a close then. As in finishing, I'd like to thank again all of our speakers, all of the people who've taken the time out of the afternoon to be and join us, all of the TPS members who, without them, we wouldn't be able to do any of this. I've asked Brogan just to pop the sponsors slide back up again. So all of these organisations have provided additional funding to TPS, often on top of their role as stakeholder members of the society. So a big thank you to all of them. Big thank thank you to Brogan and the PTRC team and the JFG team as well for helping make this event happen. And then just as a final note, if you haven't already signed up, we would love to see you all at our Transport Planning Day on November the 15th. We'll be sending out an email after the event today with registration links. It's shaping up to be a really interesting event. I'm slightly nervous about chairing it because we have an august lineup of speakers, but I really hope that you can get involved in that, and indeed you can run your own events linked to transport planning. And it's our objective to try and get transport planning to penetrate the national consciousness and have us trending on social media on that day with the hashtag TP Day 2021. Okay, so on that note, we're a couple of minutes over. I'll draw it to a close and say enjoy yourself this evening, and hopefully see you again at another TPS event in the near future. Many thanks.